I still remember the exact moment my world cracked open like glass beneath my feet. It was a Thursday evening, ordinary and quiet, the kind that hums softly with the sound of a ticking clock and distant cars passing by. I was standing at the kitchen counter, folding laundry while dinner simmered on the stove, when my daughter, Lily, walked in with her phone in hand and a look on her face I couldn't quite name. She used to smile at me, you know. Once upon a time, she'd burst into the kitchen after school, arms open, talking about her day and her dreams, her words tumbling faster than her breath. But that night, something had changed. Her eyes carried a coldness I'd never seen before, like she had already made up her mind about something I didn't even know was wrong. "Mom," she said, her tone sharp and distant, "you really need to stop embarrassing me." I turned, confused. "Embarrassing you?" I asked softly. She rolled her eyes, sighing the way teenagers do when they think they're talking to someone hopeless. "Yeah," she snapped. "You show up everywhere like some old, pathetic woman who doesn't know when to quit. You act like you're still young, but you're not. It's just sad." Those words, old, pathetic, they didn't just sting, they burned straight through me. I froze, holding a folded towel in my hand, feeling something inside me crumble. I wanted to laugh it off, maybe tell her she was being silly, but I saw it in her face. She meant it. Every word. "Lily," I whispered, trying to stay calm. "What did I do?" She shook her head like I was too much to handle. "You don't get it, Mom. You never do. You wear those outdated clothes, talk to my friends like you're one of us, and post your cringe Facebook photos like some desperate old lady trying to stay relevant. It's embarrassing. Just stop." She turned and walked out before I could say a word, her door slamming shut, the echo spreading through the house like a wound. I stood there, staring at the towel in my hand, the steam from the pot rising like a ghost behind me. I didn't cry. Not right away. Instead, I just stood still, listening to the house breathe in silence. The same house where I'd raised her, loved her, fought for her, sacrificed everything to give her a better life. And now I was just pathetic. That night, I sat on my bed long after she fell asleep, staring at the faded family photos on my nightstand. There we were, Lily as a little girl, missing her front teeth, sitting on my lap, her tiny arms wrapped around my neck. I'd given her everything. When her father walked out on us years ago, I didn't fall apart. I worked double shifts, skipped meals, and kept my head high. I built this home brick by brick with my own hands, believing love was enough. But that night, for the first time, I wondered if it wasn't. The next morning, I tried to talk to her again, hoping it was just teenage anger, a moment she'd regret. I knocked softly on her door. "Lily, can we talk?" I asked. She groaned, her voice muffled by the pillow. "Not now, Mom, I'm busy." "Please," I said, my voice trembling despite myself. She sighed loudly and opened the door halfway. "What?" I took a breath. "About last night. Did you really mean what you said?" She shrugged. "Yeah, I mean, I didn't say it to hurt you, but it's true. You need to stop living in the past. You're not young anymore. Maybe it's time you accepted that." I wanted to tell her that youth isn't just about age, it's about heart, about strength, but the words felt useless. She wasn't listening. She was already lost somewhere between pride and influence, the kind that comes from a world I didn't belong to anymore. Instagram, TikTok, filters, and friends who judged by clothes and cars. Later that week, I saw her with someone new. A man. Older, probably twice her age, dressed in designer clothes, driving a sleek black car. They pulled up in front of our house, and I watched from the window as she laughed in a way she hadn't with me in months. Her head thrown back, her hand on his arm, her smile bright but strange, like she was wearing someone else's face. I stepped outside, pretending to water the plants, my heart pounding. "Lily," I called, forcing a smile. She stiffened instantly. "Mom, what are you doing out here?" "Just saying hello," I said softly, glancing at the man. He looked at me like I was invisible, his hand resting casually on her shoulder. "You must be Lily's mother," he said with a smooth smile. "She talks about you sometimes." I nodded, unsure what to say. There was something about him that made my stomach twist, not fear, exactly, but unease. His eyes were too confident, too calculating. "Nice to meet you," I managed. Lily groaned. "Mom, we're going out." "Don't wait up, okay?" And just like that, they were gone, leaving me standing there on the porch, the wind cold against my skin. That night, I didn't sleep. I sat in the living room, waiting for her to come home, staring at the front door as hours passed. When she finally walked in close to midnight, I noticed her makeup smudged, her perfume too strong, her smile forced. "You okay?" I asked quietly. "I'm fine," she muttered, brushing past me. "You smell like his cologne," I said before I could stop myself. She turned sharply, eyes blazing. "So what? You jealous now? Because someone actually likes me?" My breath caught. "That man, he's much older than you, Lily. You don't know what he wants." "He respects me," she shot back. "He listens to me, treats me like I matter. Unlike you, always judging, always controlling." I wanted to scream that everything I did was for her, that every rule, every worry, every sleepless night was born from love. But she was already walking away. That's when I realized something I hadn't wanted to see. She wasn't just angry. She was lost. And I had no idea how to bring her back. The next few weeks were a blur of arguments and distance. She stopped eating with me, stopped talking except for short, sharp words. Every time that man's car showed up, she ran out the door like freedom waited in his arms. My friends told me to let her go, that she'd learn the hard way, but how could I? She was my daughter, my only family, the person I'd built my life around. And yet, slowly, she was slipping through my fingers like sand. One night, I followed her. I know it sounds wrong, but I had to. My heart wouldn't let me sit still anymore. I watched from across the street as she entered a fancy restaurant with him. They laughed, she looked happy, but then I saw it. The way he talked to the waitress, cold and dismissive. The way his eyes lingered on other women, even as Lily smiled up at him. My stomach turned. Something was wrong. Deeply wrong. But how could I tell her without pushing her further away? That question haunted me every night. Until one evening when everything changed. She came home crying. Her mascara streaked down her cheeks, her hands shaking. "Lily," I whispered, running to her. "What happened?" She looked at me with broken eyes and whispered, "You were right about him." My heart sank. What did he do? She bit her lip, tears spilling. He said I wasn't good enough for his world, that I was just entertainment. I held her as she cried, stroking her hair, whispering, "It's okay, baby. You're safe now." But deep inside, something else began to stir, a quiet, burning anger. Not just at him, but at the world that made her believe she had to destroy herself to feel worthy. I didn't know it then, but that moment right there was the start of everything. The beginning of my revenge. Not against him alone, but against the lies, the judgments, the cruelty that had taken my daughter away from me. And as I held her trembling body that night, I made a silent promise. I would not let this break us. Not again. But I also knew something had changed in me. I wasn't the same woman she called old and pathetic. That woman was gone. What remained was someone she had never met before, someone who had nothing left to lose. I woke up the next morning feeling something I hadn't felt in years, a strange, cold clarity that settled deep in my chest. The air was still, the house quiet except for the soft hum of the refrigerator and the faint ticking of the clock. Lily was still asleep in her room. Her door was half open, and for a moment I stood there just looking at her. She looked so young, so fragile, her mascara still smudged from the night before. It reminded me of when she was little, how she'd crawl into my bed after a nightmare, her small hand clutching mine. I wanted to go to her to tell her that everything would be all right, but I stopped myself, because deep down I knew things would never be the same again. Not after last night. Not after what that man did to her. I went to the kitchen, poured myself a cup of coffee, and stared out the window as the morning light began to fill the sky. I thought about him, the man who had smiled at me so confidently, like he owned the world. I didn't know his name then, but I knew his type. I had seen men like him before, charming, powerful, the kind who used people like stepping stones and discarded them when they were no longer useful. He had taken advantage of my daughter's innocence, her need for validation, and twisted it into something cruel. That thought alone made my hands tremble with rage. But I didn't let the anger consume me. Not this time. Instead, I began to think, to plan. When Lily finally came into the kitchen a few hours later, her eyes were swollen, her hair a mess, and she looked lost. "Mom," she whispered, her voice trembling. "I'm sorry." I turned slowly to face her. "For what, sweetheart?" She bit her lip. "For what I said. For calling you those things." Her voice cracked. "I didn't mean it. I was just angry, and I wanted to feel grown up, and he made me feel like I was." I stepped closer and gently cupped her cheek. "It's all right." I said softly. "You made a mistake, but it doesn't define you." She nodded, tears filling her eyes again. "He said I was nothing without him, that I'd never make it on my own, that no one would ever want me after him." I felt my chest tighten. "He's wrong," I said firmly. "You are more than enough. You just forgot who you were for a while." She looked at me then, like she was seeing me for the first time in years. "What do I do now?" she whispered. I smiled faintly. "We rebuild, together." But even as I said it, part of me knew I couldn't let that man walk away untouched. Because this wasn't just about Lily anymore. It was about every woman who had ever been made to feel small, every mother who had been dismissed, every sacrifice that had been mocked or forgotten. And I knew with every fiber of my being that I would make him regret what he did. Over the next few days, I quietly started to learn about him. His name was Victor Hale, a wealthy businessman who owned several car dealerships around the city. A man with influence, charm, and a reputation for being generous. But beneath that polished surface, I began to find cracks. Former employees who spoke of manipulation and lies. Women who disappeared from his life after short, flashy relationships. Whispers of deals that weren't as clean as they looked. I wrote everything down. Every name, every connection. I didn't know exactly what I was going to do yet, but I knew I had to be smart. If I confronted him outright, he'd twist it, make me look like some bitter old woman seeking attention. No, I needed to expose him the way he'd exposed my daughter, to strip away his mask in front of everyone who believed in his charm. One afternoon, while Lily was out for a walk, I drove to one of his showrooms. I parked across the street and just watched. He was there, laughing with a group of customers, his hand resting casually on the shoulder of a young woman in her early 20s. She smiled, flattered, unaware of what he was. I gripped the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. For a second, I wanted to storm inside, to scream the truth in front of everyone. But then I remembered Lily's tear-streaked face. No, not yet. I needed to be careful. I needed him to destroy himself. That night, as I sat in the quiet of the living room, Lily came and sat beside me. "Mom," she said softly, "I want to forget all of it." I turned to her. "You will," I said, "but not by pretending it didn't happen. You'll forget it by rising above it." She looked confused. "How?" "By becoming someone who doesn't need people like him. Someone who can stand on her own." She smiled faintly. "Like you?" I paused. "Something like that." For the first time in weeks, we sat together, just talking. About life, dreams, even silly things like how she used to steal cookies before dinner. It felt almost normal again, but deep down, I knew I was walking two paths now, one as a mother helping her daughter heal, and the other as a woman preparing for justice. The next day, I visited my old friend, Grace, who worked as a local journalist. We hadn't spoken in years, but she greeted me warmly. "Elena Carter," she said with a grin, "you look like a woman on a mission." "Maybe I am," I said quietly. Over coffee, I told her everything about Victor, about Lily, about how he preyed on young women. Grace listened carefully, her eyes narrowing as I spoke. "He's been on our radar before," she said finally. "We've had complaints, but nothing concrete. He's careful." "Then let's give him something concrete," I said. She studied me for a moment. "You're serious, dead serious." She leaned forward. "All right. If you can get me evidence, messages, photos, anything, I'll make sure his story gets out." "But Elena, this could get messy." I nodded. "I don't care. He already made a mess of our lives." The next few weeks were a blur of quiet determination. Lily slowly started to rebuild herself. She got a part-time job at a cafe, started painting again, and even laugh sometimes. But every time I saw her smile, I thought of the man who had taken that light away. I couldn't rest until he was exposed. I started digging through Lily's old messages. She had deleted most of them, but some remained: screenshots, old texts, bits of conversation that hinted at his manipulation. It wasn't enough yet, but it was a start. Then, one evening, something unexpected happened. Victor showed up at our door. I opened it, my heart pounding, my breath catching in my throat. He smiled that same confident smile. "Mrs. Carter," he said smoothly, "I think we need to talk." I didn't move. "About what?" "About Lily," he said, his tone dripping with fake concern. "I think she's been saying things about me that aren't true." I met his gaze evenly. Everything she said was true. His smile tightened. "You know, rumors can destroy people, Mrs. Carter. You wouldn't want that, would you?" "You already destroyed her," I said quietly. His eyes flashed for a moment before he composed himself again. "Careful," he said softly. "You don't know who you're dealing with." "Actually," I said, stepping closer, "I think I do." For a second, he looked uncertain. Then he smiled again, but this time it didn't reach his eyes. "You'll regret this," he said before turning and walking back to his car. I closed the door slowly, my hands shaking. But instead of fear, I felt something else: resolve. He had made the mistake of coming here. Now it was personal. The next morning, I called Grace. "He came to my house," I told her. "Good," she said. "That means he's nervous. Keep pushing. But be careful." "Don't worry," I said, my voice calm. "I know exactly what I'm doing." And as I hung up the phone, I realized I truly did. For the first time in years, I wasn't just surviving. I was fighting back. I began to move like someone who had learned how to hide a fire beneath a calm face, waking before dawn, making coffee, then sitting with a notebook where I wrote names and times and the small details that would become a map. The more I looked, the more I found. There were receipts that didn't line up with public statements, charity donations that circled back to shell companies, employees who left quietly with nervous smiles and eyes that wouldn't meet mine. I learned to listen for the little tells hesitations on the phone, cleared throats, the way a man's smile tightened when a conversation turned to responsibility. Every scrap I collected felt like another brick in a path that would lead to him. I started small, doing things that felt safe and smart, saving screenshots, asking Lily for the few messages she hadn't deleted, gently coaxing memories out of her without making her relive the worst moments. Sometimes she would talk, other times she would shut down and stare out the window like someone waiting for a storm to pass. Her healing was slow, and it broke my heart, but it also gave me something very practical: time to prepare. Grace kept her end of the bargain. She called me with tips about other women who had stepped away from Victor's life, women who had once smiled for the cameras and then retreated into quiet shame. One by one, they came forward to meet me in cafes or church basements, faces shadowed at first, then growing more open as they realized they were not alone. Their stories were similar: promises of a better life, invitations to exclusive events, expensive gifts used as chains to hold them close, and then the cold pull when they no longer entertained or served the image he needed. I listened and I wrote everything down. Grace warned me that the bigger the story, the harder he would hit back, and Victor did not hesitate. He tried to muddy the water by sending a lawyer's letter to our house, thinly veiled threats about defamation and ruin. He hired a private investigator who trailed me for a week, showing up once outside my volunteer shift at the community center. I should have been afraid. Instead, I felt more focused. Each of his moves only proved how high the stakes were, how important it was to cut clean and deep. I set up a plan with Grace that was simple in theory and complex in practice. We would gather anything that proved pattern and intent, not just one-off mistakes. We wanted to show the world that Victor's behavior wasn't an accident or a misunderstanding. We wanted an irrefutable trail. That meant finding financial links, recorded conversations, witnesses who would speak on the record, and a timeline that matched his public persona to his private manipulation. My days filled with research and small deceptions, calling his showrooms, pretending to be a customer to ask about policies, sitting in waiting rooms where his staff took a cigarette break so I could talk to them about how things really worked. I learned to sound like I was asking nothing of consequence while asking everything. At night, I would go over the notes with Lily, showing her the pieces one by one, helping her stitch them into a picture that made sense. It was therapeutic for her to see the pattern, to stop blaming herself for not seeing it sooner. Sometimes she would ask questions with a quiet, desperate curiosity. Did he ever love anyone? How could he be so kind and cruel at once? I had no answer that didn't sound like a lecture, so I answered with truth and patience. The weeks turned into months, and our little archive grew heavy. Grace began to write, but only when we had enough to keep her safe and professional. She told me she would run a careful piece that exposed the pattern without crossing into recklessness. We scheduled interviews with a woman who had taken photographs of Victor's meetings, with a former employee who had kept spreadsheets showing irregular payments, and with a charity auditor who hinted that Victor's public donations were sometimes a wash money offered and then quietly redirected. All of this had to be lined up perfectly. Timing mattered. Victor's public image was his shield. Tear a hole in it in front of the right people, and the rest could tumble. The night before Grace planned to run the first of her investigative pieces, Victor struck back in a way I hadn't expected. He invited Lily to one of his charity galas, a glittering evening filled with cameras and people who clapped for the right names. I begged her not to go, knowing how these events could make a young person drown in flattery and illusion, but she wanted to test herself, to prove she could look him in the eye and not crumble. She told me she wanted to gather courage, not to be tempted. I let her go, and that decision would become one of the worst and one of the most useful I ever made. The gala was a maze of smiles and soft lights. I watched from a distance with Grace and a borrowed camera, keeping to the edge of the crowd, my heart pounding like it might give away my position. Lily moved through the room with a new steadiness. I caught glimpses of her laughing politely, then pulling away to the balcony when she needed air. Victor must have seen her. He moved with predator grace, sliding into the conversation next to her, offering compliments that sounded rehearsed. I wanted to step forward, to take Lily by the arm and walk her home, but I waited, because Grace whispered that if he tried something in public, it would be harder for him to deny it. And then he did something I never expected. He gave a short speech about mentorship and supporting young talent, and he singled Lily out in a way that made the room look at us. He praised her for having confidence beyond her years and invited her to speak with him about a scholarship he was organizing. The room applauded, and my stomach clenched. After the applause, he approached our small group and, in front of cameramen, he draped an arm around Lily's shoulders in a staged, intimate way meant to look protective. The cameras loved it. It was a photo opportunity that would appear on his social feeds as evidence of generosity. But under the staged warmth, his hand brushed the underside of her arm in a way that made Lily step back, her face tightening. I saw it, Grace saw it. We had our moment. In the following days, Grace published a careful piece that did not accuse him directly, but laid out the pattern interviews with women who described grooming, and then abandonment, discrepancies in corporate filings, and a picture of a man who used power to create illusion. People began to talk. Victor lashed out publicly, calling the article sensationalized and baseless. He arranged for an artful rebuttal on his social feeds showing him with veterans and with schoolchildren, creating a counter-narrative of benevolence. The next move was his lawyer again, more threatening and more specific. It should have frightened me, and for a night it did. But the town had already started to whisper, and some of Victor's supposed friends began to look uncomfortable when we mentioned his name. Even his dealership staff avoided eye contact when I walked in for a look around, because they could see the story was moving into a place where their involvement might become a stain on their resumes. The pressure worked both ways. We kept pushing. With Grace's help, we arranged for a local auditor to look into the charity Victor touted as his pride. The auditor found irregularities that looked like money laundering payments, routed through companies that existed only on paper. Those were the kind of facts you couldn't spin away with a prepared smile or a shiny photograph. When Grace published the deeper piece, complete with documents and a testimonial from a former accountant who feared for her career yet spoke anyway, the story cut through the city's polite noise. Victor's phone started ringing with reporters, and a city council member called for an inquiry into his charity's accounts. He tried to hit back harder. He called me at odd hours with a voice that sounded calm but carried an undercurrent of menace, telling me to stop, to protect my daughter, to leave his name out of our mouths. I used to imagine my life without such men making me small. Now, when he tried to scare me, I felt almost pity. The law took its own course as the auditors and journalists did their work. Catastrophe was not sudden. It was procedural. Papers were subpoenaed, meetings were watched. Victor attempted to discredit witnesses with hired PR and lawyers. But when enough independent voices line up men and women who had been treated as collateral in his rise, then doubt tiptoes away and truth moves in to sit at the head of the table. Through all of this, Lily found her strength in strange, slow ways. She started attending a support group for women who had been manipulated by powerful people, and she spoke once on a small stage about shame and recovery. Her voice trembled at first, but then steadied, and she smiled at me afterward like someone who had survived a storm and found a solid place to stand. There were nights when she slept fitfully and mornings when the old coldness would return, but step by step she began to remember the person she had been before the glamour and the lies. I watched her reclaim pieces of herself, her sketchbook revived. Her laughter returned to the kitchen, the way she would quietly make a cup of tea for me in the afternoon with a small, shy smile. Those little things fed me like sunlight. They reminded me why I had started this fight. I hadn't done it out of anger alone. I had done it to give her back her life. The fight wasn't clean or noble in the old romantic sense. It was murky, bureaucratic, and exhausting. But it worked. The city's inquiry expanded. Sponsors pulled away from Victor's events, and at one dealership his main investor withdrew funding. His image, once polished and impermeable, began to flake like paint in rain. And in the middle of that slow collapse, when the cameras weren't rolling and the headlines were between editions, I found myself standing in the hallway of our home thinking, not of celebration, but of the quiet moment when truth would finally be unavoidable. I had a plan for that too. I wanted the final moment to be simple and public, and to leave him with no room for the rehearsed charm that had saved him before. I wanted him to feel the exposure in the same place he had used as a stage for his myths. I kept the plan close to my chest, and like everything else, I moved carefully. The final act of my plan began on an ordinary morning. One of those quiet, deceptive mornings where nothing seems capable of collapse. The air was soft, sunlight slipping through thin clouds, and the world outside my window hummed with the indifferent rhythm of traffic and life. It felt strange that something so calm could coexist with what I was about to do. I had waited months for this exact day, the day Victor was set to host a grand community event, celebrating his dealership's 20th anniversary. There would be cameras, reporters, and politicians, all eager to be seen next to the man everyone had once believed untouchable. It was perfect. The very stage he had used to build his myth would become the place it unraveled. Grace and I had everything ready. The night before, she sent me a message with 3 words, tomorrow. It breaks. She had coordinated the final publication, the one that would include the leaked audit report, testimonies from 2 former employees, and the photograph of Victor and Lily at the gala. The picture, once framed as a moment of mentorship, now served as visual proof of manipulation. Grace didn't need to exaggerate anything. She simply placed the truth in front of people and let it speak. I dressed carefully that morning, not for disguise but for clarity. A plain gray blouse, dark jeans, and my mother's old wristwatch. The same one I had worn the day I left this town years ago. The irony was not lost on me. Leaving had once felt like freedom, and returning had felt like punishment. Now it felt like justice. Lily watched me from the kitchen table, nervous but composed. Her eyes had regained something fierce, not the naive shine she once had, but a deeper steadiness. "Are you sure you have to go?" she asked. I nodded. "I need to see it end." She hesitated, then stood and hugged me, her arms thin but strong. "Then make sure he knows who did it," she whispered. When I arrived at the dealership, the parking lot gleamed with new cars and white tents. The banners fluttered with Victor's name and slogans about community, trust, and legacy. It might have fooled anyone passing by, but I had seen what those words really meant. I recognized the staff's rehearsed smiles, the crisp uniforms, the photographers adjusting their lenses for the best angles. And then there he was, Victor Halle himself, stepping out of a black SUV, radiant in his navy suit, that same perfect composure that once made people feel safe. If he saw me, he didn't show it. He moved through the crowd with a politician's ease, shaking hands, offering smiles that never touched his eyes. But there was a crack in his performance now, subtle, but there. The way he glanced too often at his phone, the stiffness in his shoulders. Grace's article had already gone live. He must have read it before stepping out. I stood at the edge of the crowd, blending in among the guests until the speeches began. One by one, local officials praised Victor for his contributions. I felt my pulse tighten. When he finally took the stage, the air shifted, that familiar hush that comes when people expect greatness. He began with his usual confidence, speaking about resilience and reputation, about how challenges test true character. And then, as if on cue, the screens behind him flickered. It happened almost imperceptibly at first. A small glitch, a distortion in the feed. Then the dealership's promotional slideshow was replaced by something else, a still image of Victor with Lily at the gala. The photograph Grace had chosen. The caption beneath it was one sentence long. Behind every smile, there is a story. Then, the slides began to change. Screenshots from documents, excerpts from the audit report, and snippets of testimony. Names blurred for protection, but the pattern was clear. Fraud, exploitation, manipulation. The crowd shifted uneasily, whispers turning into murmurs, murmurs into gasps. Victor froze. His microphone slipped in his hand for just a moment, and the mask cracked. He turned toward the screen, pale under the lights. The PR team scrambled, trying to shut it down, but Grace had planned it too well. The feed was mirrored across live-streamed platforms, and news outlets were already picking it up. He tried to speak, to regain control, but the words came out fractured. This is a misrepresentation," he stammered, his voice tight. "A targeted smear campaign." I stepped forward. Not onto the stage, not into the cameras, but just close enough that he could see me clearly. Our eyes met, and for the first time I saw something I had never seen in him before. Not charm, not arrogance, but fear. He recognized me instantly. His lips parted slightly, and the microphone trembled in his hand. "Elena," he said under his breath, barely audible through the mic. I didn't respond. I didn't need to. The noise around us swelled. Reporters shouting questions, flashes popping, staff running to cut the feed. But it was already too late. The truth was out, and once it's out, it doesn't crawl back into silence. Within hours, Victor's empire began to crumble. Sponsors issued statements of concern. His business accounts were frozen pending investigation. Grace's article became the top story of the week. Lily's photo was everywhere, though we had made sure her name was protected. That evening, as the sun set behind the dealership's glass facade, I sat in my car and watched the place empty. The man who had once seemed untouchable now looked like an abandoned reflection in a cracked mirror. I didn't feel triumph, not exactly. What I felt was something deeper, quieter. The closing of a wound. I drove home slowly, every street familiar again, every breath easier. When I walked through the door, Lily was waiting with 2 cups of tea. She didn't ask what happened. She already knew. She just smiled and said, "It's over, isn't it?" I nodded. "It's over." But in truth, it wasn't an ending. It was a beginning, for her, for me, for every woman who had been told to stay quiet. The world wouldn't forget Victor Hale's name anytime soon, but neither would it forget the women who finally broke his silence. That night, for the first time in years, the house felt light again. Lily slept peacefully. I sat by the window, watching the moon rise, and I realized that revenge, when it's done right, doesn't destroy you. It restores what was taken. And for the first time, I felt whole when the noise finally faded and the days began to stretch into something resembling calm. I found myself standing in front of the mirror one morning, feeling the strange stillness that comes when a storm has passed. I looked older than I remembered, not just in years, but in everything. I had carried. My reflection was not the woman who had been broken in her kitchen months ago, but someone tempered, someone who had faced the fire and walked through it. The news had taken its course. Victor Hale's face was now the face of disgrace. Investigations piling one after another, the truth spreading in quiet, unstoppable waves. His empire shrinking like sand slipping through open hands. He tried to fight back at first, tried to claim innocence, blame others, threaten lawsuits, but his words no longer had power because people had seen too much and believed too little. The world moved on, and he faded into the background of whispers and shame. I never went near his world again. I didn't need to. Justice had done what it always does. Slowly but completely, Lily began to smile again, real smiles, not the practiced ones she used to wear when pretending everything was fine. She started taking classes in design, began rebuilding her life step by step. We didn't talk much about the past. It lingered there like old smoke, but we both knew that some things didn't need words. We lived quietly, cooked dinner together, watched movies, laughed, sometimes cried, sometimes. The house that had once felt like a battlefield now felt like home again. And every evening when I saw her sitting at the table, I realized how far we had come, how far pain had pushed us into understanding what truly mattered. The neighborhood stopped looking at us with pity. People came back around. Those who had turned their faces away during the worst of it now spoke gently again. But I didn't hold grudges. Life is too heavy to carry bitterness forever. I learned that revenge is not about destroying others. It is about reclaiming the pieces of yourself they took away. It's about standing in the ruins and realizing you survived stronger than before. Months later, I heard Victor had sold everything and moved away. Some said he lived in a small apartment far from town. Others said he left the country. I didn't care. His absence was enough. I didn't need to see him broken. I only needed him gone. One evening, Lily handed me a small notebook, her handwriting neat but trembling. She said she wanted to show me something. Inside were sketches of a woman standing beneath a tree, eyes closed, sunlight touching her face. The caption said, "Peace after the storm," and beneath it she had written, "For Mom, the strongest woman I know." I couldn't speak for a long time because that moment meant more than any apology could ever offer. It was forgiveness, not just for me, but for herself, for the mistakes, for the blind trust, for the pain we both carried that night. We sat on the porch listening to crickets and talking about everything and nothing, the way mothers and daughters do when they finally find safety in silence. In the months that followed, I found work again, not at the dealership, but at a small community center, teaching young women about financial independence, how to recognize manipulation, how to never lose their own name in someone else's shadow. It felt like starting over in a way that healed every wound one by one. Sometimes I would tell parts of my story, not all of it, but enough for them to understand that betrayal doesn't have to define you, it can free you if you let it. One girl once asked me if I ever regretted exposing Victor, and I told her no, because if I hadn't done it, I would still be living in the quiet cage of fear, pretending not to see the cracks in my life. Fear feeds on silence, and I had learned to speak. The town changed, two small ways, but important ones. People began to question things, to speak up when something felt wrong. Grace continued her work, turning our story into an article that reached even farther than we expected. It became part of a larger conversation about power and trust and the quiet resilience of women who had been underestimated for too long. She visited us once months later, brought flowers and a hug that said everything words couldn't. She told me that the world was listening now, that maybe the story of one mother and one daughter had lit a spark somewhere, and that thought alone made every painful night worth it. As for Lily, she moved out eventually, not far, just to her own apartment. She said she needed to learn who she was without the weight of the past. I helped her pack, watched her fill boxes with things that had once filled our life, and when she hugged me goodbye, she said something I will never forget. She said, "You didn't just save me, Mom, you taught me how to save myself." And when she walked away into her own new beginning, I felt no sadness, only pride. I returned to an empty house that didn't feel empty anymore. It felt full of echoes, full of memories that no longer hurt, just reminded me of where we had been. I cleaned the kitchen one last time, looked out the window, where it had all started that day when words like old and pathetic had torn my heart apart. Now those same words felt powerless because I had proven them wrong in every way. I wasn't old. I was alive. I wasn't pathetic. I was powerful. I wasn't broken. I was rebuilt. And on quiet nights when the world slows down, I sit with a cup of tea and let my thoughts drift. I think of the young woman I once was, the one who believed love meant sacrifice, and I whisper to her that she deserved better all along. I think of Lily and how her laughter now sounds like light, not apology. I think of Victor somewhere alone with his ghosts, and I hope he remembers not my anger but my silence, the silence of a woman who didn't scream but acted, who didn't destroy but revealed, who didn't hate but healed. The moral of my story isn't revenge, it's revelation. Sometimes the people we love the most are the ones who break us, so we can see who we really are. Sometimes betrayal is not the end, it's the beginning of truth. And if you ever find yourself standing in the ruins of what someone did to you, don't let it be your ending, let it be your rebirth, because strength is not built in comfort, it's born in pain, and every scar we carry is just proof that we survived to tell the story I survived to tell. Mine.